Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to the Finding Islam podcast. I'm Abeer, lifestyle editor for Finding Islam, joined by Zain, analytical editor of Finding Islam, and Khubaib, fellow previous editor for Finding Islam, and still friend of the blog and the podcast. The best way to describe you, I think. So, I am aware that there's a reflection of my glasses, probably of the France Morocco game. It is what it is. I have it on in the background until it ends.
No worries. Your attention's on that.
Glancing at it, so it is what it is. But exactly. Unfortunately, France winning, but what can you do? So like this podcast should be an interesting discussion, inshallah. I know we're framing it mainly on kind of a lot of the different books that you two have both been reading. There's a lot of kind of common books you've both been reading regarding things such as the Enlightenment, Orientalism, and different aspects such as that. So we'll start diving into it pretty soon. And well, I suppose just kind of because it is the current kind of topic, although we do plan to have a full episode later discussing the World Cup, but it's probably a good starting point, just on, I suppose, the dialogue that's been going around with the World Cup. As we're all aware, with it being in Qatar, it was a controversial decision at the time when the bid was completed and shown that Qatar had won. And since then, most of the particularly Western press around the event has been focused on things such as issues with the migrant workers building the stadiums and so on, their working conditions, and the alleged number of deaths that happened during construction. On top of that, the main kind of talking point's been on the LGBT issue, and I suppose Qatar as a conservative Muslim country not having gay marriage and kind of open homosexuality as permitted as it is here in the West. I suppose for you guys, what was your kind of take on it? Because it certainly brought a lot of interesting talking points. I think particularly from as Muslims especially, it kind of led to us perhaps defending Qatar in many ways, which we probably wouldn't have done previously, when it comes to kind of the Gulf countries in general, which aren't all the same, but I suppose do have their issues.
Well, off the top of the head, I suppose what's been really obvious about some of the narratives coming out about Qatar and the World Cup and the various things that they're being accused of is that it just doesn't seem like a balanced discussion about the nature of society in Qatar, because there's, like, most countries on earth have their problems, including Western countries, and the own mistakes they make. So it just doesn't sound like something like a sincere critique of Qatari practice. What it does sound like is that a lot of the things that are being said are coming from an ideological place, a place that is sort of a place of condescension on Qatar and Arabs and Muslims as a whole, where that people are uncomfortable about the fact that a very successful, prestigious event is taking place in a country of Arab Muslims. That's what it really feels like, and I suppose that sort of makes us think, like, why is that happening, and what's the source of this? Like, where are these narratives coming from? Like, what's the ideology pushing forward this hostility towards Islam and towards, like, just Muslims doing well? What is that? Where is that coming from?
Yeah, no, you definitely do feel that there is more at play here than simply Qatar holding the World Cup, and there is more at play here than I don't know, Germany winning or France winning or so on. Events like this, perhaps we were going into it naively, but now that we're where we are, it becomes quite clear that events of this nature, perhaps this is perhaps the reason that it was designed as a prestige project by the Qataris. They probably thought it would reflect their culture well and so on. But at the same time, what that has created is almost a clash of worldviews and so on. And this is exactly what we have been seeing on the ground. Whether initially when it comes to the issues of migrant workers, and whether when it comes to the thing that came out most recently, which is of course the matter of homosexuality in Qatar and the rights of people who ascribe to that. What becomes clear is that victory and loss and so on here is more than just a sporting achievement. It's there are political statements being made, there are ideological statements being made, and there are statements as to the civilization or lack thereof of those who are taking part. So, and of course, perhaps from our perspective, the ones who have been very much very much pushing these issues have been the Western countries, Western media outlets, and we've seen this very strongly. As Zain mentioned, what this raises for us is the question of where do these come from? Where do these things come from? Where do these ideologies and so on come from that are being pushed on to Qatar and many other states, not Qatar alone? What is their genealogy and where have they come from? So I think that's a very important question to raise, and a very important topic to explore. Perhaps we can jump into that, and it's been very much as you mentioned, Abeer, a major element of our reading of late. So I think perhaps we'd be well versed to talk about it a little.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good entry point anyway into some of those readings. So we can just jump into that, I'd say, and save the rest of the Qatar talk for that full podcast, inshallah. So do you guys want to kind of just go into that, maybe with a more recent example of some?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we're going to talk about the genealogy of these ideas that we're seeing nowadays, I think the best starting point would be, I'm not sure if you'd agree with me, Zain, would be the Enlightenment and Enlightenment thought, and what that has done to the European worldview and European ideology as a whole, or ideologies, I should say.
No, I agree absolutely. It's easier to throw the blame everything on philosophical liberalism and the problem that liberalism has with Islam and with Muslims and Muslim societies. But I think if we're looking at things genealogically and trying to understand the origin and the worldview of things, then really we'd have to start, I think, with the Enlightenment, because that is the progenitor of liberalism and capitalism and feminism and just the overall the Western worldview.
And I mean, I guess what the Enlightenment was for Europe was a massive departure from what was predominantly very much a Christian worldview beforehand, and the Enlightenment comes along with the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment more firmly comes along and really sweeps a lot of that aside. Not entirely, you do have continuations as with any with any passage or transition from one worldview or one ideological position to another. But it was very much a rebellion against the Christian worldview and a lot of the things that had. So we go from perhaps I would say a moral worldview, one which is based in the moral conception of the world that Christianity had, to one that is more fixed in material philosophy, in conceptions of ancient Greek conceptions of the citizen and the good and so on, and then you have this kind of philosophical eruption, which perhaps the most important, one of the most important of which is the concept of progress. I would say the idea of progress. You go from a moral conception of the world where everything is geared towards achieving moral virtue or moral excellence, to one where actually what we need to do is we need to achieve kind of material and other forms of progress. I'm not sure.
Yeah, you can see that today. We jokingly touched on this, but the discussion on can the effects of colonialism on Africa and other kind of nations in parts of the world. And there's still reports coming out, on like how much kind of material impact that had on these nations, as well as things like the lives lost and such. Is incalculable, the damage that's done. But these nations today typically get viewed as successful or unsuccessful based off of their material success, as you point out. Except with Qatar, because in that regard, Qatar should be viewed as a success. So obviously, the Emirates in general is, of course, or the Gulf, I should say, is very financially powerful, resource rich as well. But the discussion went, in a different direction. Specifically with those countries, kind of feels a little bit like a second Enlightenment, kind of in that sense.
Yeah, no, because the very concept of progress and maybe this understanding how the concept of progress is framed can help us understand why Qatar was viewed in this way, and perhaps African countries which are still developing as in the modern economic balance, why they are viewed by a different lens. I don't know if you want to say anything about progress journey, where it comes from, and what it means, Zain. And maybe I can comment a little afterwards.
Sure. Well, I think it's great that you highlighted the idea of progress, and I think the first thing to recognize about that is it's not just some word that means change or something better. It's a very ideological world, and this is obviously a very ideological discussion that's taking place in Qatar right now. And the word progress and the myth of progress is actually like sort of one of the paradigmatic features of the Enlightenment. There's several essential features of the Enlightenment which are really important. One, to understand it and its progeny, such as liberalism. And then on top of that is understanding these features is also, you can also see them at play in the modern world. And so I'll just mention a couple of them. And the first one, as you alluded to, is this idea of progress, that the Enlightenment, like you were saying, is a departure from the history of European and Christian thought. The Enlightenment was, Kant specifically says in his book, What is Enlightenment? It's, man maturing from his infantile stage. The Enlightenment was about change and evolution and progress, and about leaving behind its traditions, its morality, and the history of Europe. And like you're saying, it was just a total departure. And it was, I don't know any other society on earth that did something like that, except when forced under colonialism. So it was the idea that that history and tradition should be devalued, and this idea that we should progress forward into some sort of unknown future that is constantly going to be better and improved. That's an essential feature of the Enlightenment, and it's closely related to the second feature, really, like one of the second really important features of the Enlightenment, which is universality. The Enlightenment ultimately saw itself as a universal project, that everything before it led to this moment, to this Enlightenment, and that it was the future, and it was going to create a universal civilization. And this, it might sound like off the top of the head something nice or pretty, but really what that means is that the histories and cultures and moralities of people outside of Europe were just ready to be discarded, so that the Enlightenment could roll over them. And you can see that this is something that has been performed by both Marxists and liberals and so on. Marxists, and that's what the World War II. It's not World War. That's what the Cold War was. It was a competition between two Enlightenment ideologies trying to create a universal civilization, and that they thought that humanity's progress was in the Enlightenment. That we were all progressing towards this thing, this set of values. And while they might have competed in what those values were, they had the same fundamental understanding of history and where humanity was going on in progress. So those are two things that are really important to understand about the Enlightenment. That idea that we're moving forward, progressing, evolving, developing, and that it's something that's universal. And that's what we saw when we saw the invasions of Muslim countries of Iraq and Afghanistan. It was like, okay, we're pushing forward a high ideology. That's what the invasion of Vietnam was, and all these sort of things across the 20th century. It's about creating that universal civilization, and this is why Francis Fukuyama famously wrote that really silly book, The End of History and the Last Man. History is gonna end, and we're all just gonna become liberal Democrats. What a condescending idea. Like, we're all just gonna discard Islam and our Buddhism or whatever our beliefs are in South America and Asia, and we're all just gonna become like European liberals. Like, what a condescending idea. But if you think about it, that is a paradigmatic feature of the Enlightenment, along with progress. That two interrelated features that I'm really I'm laboring the point now, but I think you guys get it, and there's a lot we can and should unpack from that.
And this is a very important concept in the sense that it's not just as you alluded to, Zain. It's not just like an idea of progress, that things will just somehow get better, or by working together or whatever we will improve things for one another. It's actually the way it's framed when you read it in some of the 19th century works. I remember I read, I think, a work by Engels, who was Marx's partner when it comes to the formulation of the of Marxist belief. He wrote a very short essay. I can't remember the name of the essay. It was a very long one and had a weird name in it. But he was talking about this concept of historical progress and how we go from one phase of development into another. And the way he was talking about it was in very scientific terms. Like, this is something that can be studied in the same way you can study, I don't know, the human body or biology. They considered it a science. So for them, progress wasn't just something they observed. It wasn't just something, oh look, this happens, and maybe we can utilize, I don't know, the power we have at the moment to ensure a certain outcome. They were like, no, this is what history itself, the force of history, this is where it's going, and we are the result of that. We are the result of everything that history has, all the history that has ever happened has been leading up to this moment, and now we are the spear point of that moment, and we need to continue going upward. In this sense, it's a very kind of weird pseudoscientific concept. I don't know what the foundations. I don't exactly. I can't understand the foundations of it in the way that they understand. I can't understand the justification for it, because there is no way that you can, I don't know, just analyze history and then make it into a science. But that's the way they understand it. So it's a very unnatural understanding of history. We need to understand this. It's a very unnatural understanding of history, which views this point in European history as the current end point of history, or the current high point of history, and they need to continue this kind of upward trajectory and progress, as it were. So everything they believe at this point is considered the best that there ever has been, and it's absolutely right, and so on. Which is why they can so confidently, for instance, go to Qatar and to talk about the ideology or force the ideology upon Qatar, or why in the 19th century they could so confidently force their views on all the peoples they colonized, and why they will continue doing that. We need to understand this. Of course, this is perhaps I'm sure you'd agree with you. I'm sure you'd agree with me, Zain. Quite different from our conception of history. Which is, of course, rooted in Islam and less in material progress and more in other things.
Yeah, I think you just, in terms of what you were saying, you drew attention to two really important things. And yeah, one, that view of history is totally unnatural and scientific. And that's a big part of the Enlightenment. It was a departure from having a metaphysical worldview where truth existed, and then it forgot about the focus wasn't on truth and morality, which was the traditional realm of most societies, a traditionally very important concern. And now it was more focused about science and a material worldview. And something that both capitalism, communism, and liberalism, they're all material worldviews. They're very scientific. And so it's only natural that they apply that to history the same way they did to economics, to social sciences, to all sorts of things. And I think what that comes down to is a fundamentally different understanding of reality than from their own past and then to Muslims and to most other societies. Because when it comes down to it, the fundamental nature of reality, or the ontology, or the metaphysics of Western civilization, is that they are in a state of becoming. That they're for them, existence is becoming. It's about change and evolution, progress, you know. Whereas for Muslims, and for even I'd say to some extent for a lot of other most other societies traditionally outside of the West, most societies, that isn't their understanding of reality. That isn't how they feel about reality. I don't want to speak about for non-Muslims, but at least for us, our understanding of reality is we are being, we exist. You know, we're not moving towards anything, and that's because, you know, the Prophet ﷺ came and he brought the miracle of Quran and perfected and taught us morality, and there's no need for us to move beyond that. You know, our tradition and our religion has the moral resources we need to live good, meaningful lives that will take care of us in this life and the next. And so there's no need for us to evolve or progress. You know, we're fine doing us. You know how, you know, and that's it's really important to understand that fundamental distinction. You know, and it's something that most Enlightenment authors, by the way, recognize that this is their understanding of reality, of their worldview. Nietzsche alludes to it. I think we remember it in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He specifically alludes to it. Carl Schmitt specifically talks about how their view of history and their worldview is one of change and development from the metaphysical to the scientific. Auguste Comte, the father of positivism, scientific positivism, he wrote a specific passage talking about how societies are supposed to evolve from the metaphysical and religious into the scientific. So it's not, what I'm saying is not controversial, and that's why Kant specifically said, you know, we're moving from our infantile to our mature stage. So it's across the Enlightenment speakers, this worldview, this essence of change and becoming. And then specifically where I'm getting the Muslim worldview, just in case anyone's wondering, I'm specifically referring to Sayyid Muhammad al-Atas, the amazing Malaysian author. He's the one who specifically highlights that Muslims are being and not becoming, and so yeah, that's an important distinction to make, that our fundamental understanding of reality is just totally different, and even from themselves, that wasn't the Greco-Roman or the Christian understanding of reality. It's just a total departure.
That's it. That's fine. And actually, on the point of the idea of progressing from one phase into another, Carl Schmitt actually in I think either in concept of the political ideology, he identifies this. You know, how in the 17th century, you know, there was the 17th or the 16th century, I'm not sure. You had the Christian worldview. That was what he termed the central domain of the time. And then you move on into 17th century Christian. 18th century, you have this kind of metaphysical, philosophical. 19th century, it's becoming more economic in nature. And then moving into the 20th century, talks about, you know, the kind of the more technical. So he says that, you know, European philosophers had observed this, and they had ascribed some kind of scientific necessity to this. You know, this is exactly how all societies have to develop. But he understood, and Wa'il Halaq after him, who was, I think, very much influenced by some of Carl Schmitt's ideas, they recognize that this is all contingent. It's not a necessity of history that this is how societies and people need to progress or develop. I don't want to say progress, develop, or but this is because Europeans can only exist in their own history and their own narrative. They saw these contingent elements of their history, and then they ascribed, as you said, universality and ultimate progress to them. And going back to why I guess the relationship between this concept and Islam, particularly when you're talking about progressing from an infantile state and leaving behind tradition and morality, this becomes very, very problematic for us as Muslims, because to discard the past, or even to view the past as being more superstitious or more backward, or as having nothing for us to be learned from that, the past is something for us to overcome and to so that we can achieve something beyond, it becomes very problematic with us who. It becomes very problematic for us, who view some of the greatest elements of, or the greatest element of our history, which is the Prophet ﷺ, to be in our past. That is our source of moral guidance and so on, and the Sahaba around him, and then those who came after them. Those for us were the peak of human moral development. So for us to take on a concept of an ideology of progress would by necessity mean that we have to put that all aside and ascribe it to backwardness and superstition. It's just at complete odds with any Islamic conception of history.
Oh, 100%, 100%. And it's honestly probably one of the central reasons that a lot of modern people are just alienated and depressed. It's you're taking everything that traditionally grounded people in societies and just chucking it out the window. It's because we're constantly progressing, then everything behind us is useless and has no value. And that's just not something that Muslims could do at all. And it's one of the reasons why that we're confronted with such shock and confusion, when the Western, when a Western person hears about Islam and its practices and its beliefs, oh, that's from hundreds of years ago. It's that's right. A Muslim today could go back 1,000 years to another Muslim, say Assalamu alaikum, kif halik ya rajul, and they could have a conversation and believe in the same things and have the same values. I could go back 1,000 years, language barriers aside, and just become friends with that person and have so much in common. And you could the modern European could go back 100 years and see an alien in his own society. That would never happen to us. And this is what first of all, this is where Nietzsche comes in really well, is because the sort of Nietzsche being sort of a really important culmination of the Enlightenment. He famously said, obviously, God is dead and the Superman is come. What he was saying is God, religion, tradition, morality, all those things are a thing of the past. And it's time for us to make new values and make our own conception of things without all that rubbish, and become supermen. And that's he said this 140 years ago. He was saying this stuff back there at the end of the 19th century in Germany before he went insane. I'm sure that had no correlation with his philosophy, but anyway, he was saying this stuff, and really, I don't know to what extent we ever moved past that culmination. That we moved past. If it just feels like we've been in a constant state, not us, the Muslims, but in terms of the world being dominated by the Enlightenment. To what extent have we just been constantly trying to progress and evolve and chuck everything out and move towards this man who doesn't exist in the future, this Superman? To what extent is that still going on? And this is why Zygmunt Bauman, another author I really like, he says that we live in liquid modernity. That the solids of religion and tradition and morality and all these sort of things, they're all being melted. Social structures, family, they're all being melted because we live in a liquid world where everything is fluid and light and can change overnight. Today is radically different to 10 years ago in Western society. The values and the beliefs and the social structures have all changed, and there's so much work being done about the family and social structures, morality, religion, history, how all this change, technology, how it's all happening. But on a very fundamental level, it just comes back to these things about the nature of the Enlightenment and the nature of Enlightenment's reality. Yeah.
I mean, as you well know, Zain, I have some slightly different understandings of Nietzsche, or how Nietzsche should be interpreted. But in terms of how he actually has been interpreted, from what we can see,
how he's been interpreted,
how he has actually in reality been interpreted, it has been very much to justify this kind of a complete lack of any kind of foundations, a complete lack of any center, and this is something that anyone who attempts to chase after Euro-American values and so on, and the project that the West is trying to implement. This is the fundamental thing that they will always come up against, which is the fact that no matter how closely you align yourself with them, at one point or another, they're going to be moving because, as you say, they're always becoming. So no sooner have you aligned yourself with their position at this moment in history, then they have moved on, and suddenly the ideologies and the principles of yesterday are no longer the principles they hold on to. What was important 10 years ago is no longer of any importance to them. If you in Qatar or Saudi Arabia or India or whatever have suddenly aligned yourself and you are in perfect alignment with what Europe was like 10 years ago, you would still be backward and uncivilized, and as far as they're concerned, you cannot win. So probably the best thing, and which is actually something that we've seen Qatar do quite well. I was quite happy to see when it comes to this is that you cannot allow yourself to play according to their rules. We have a 1400-year tradition which is solid, which has a track record, as what Halak says, a track record of success and actually giving people purpose and meaning and so on. We should stick to that. And we should give up the futile game of chasing American or European ideas of progress or what have you.
Yeah, 100%.
Sorry, just to jump in. I suppose the difficulty with that is that kind of standard is inescapable. Like American kind of and Western, I suppose, culture is so strong, and you see that even in Muslim nations. Of course, many Muslim countries are products of, Western colonialism. So the very systems that they have in place, societies and structures are all Western. So that itself is at odds with, Islam in many ways, and with kind of the idea of preservation. It goes towards that idea of progression. So I suppose, how do you get out of that psyche? Because it's very easy, even subconsciously, to have the mindset that Muslim nations or need to adapt or change, or Islam needs to adapt or change. We see that quite prevalent.
We see this kind of rhetoric quite a lot, and it ultimately goes back to what we've been discussing: the very idea that you need to adapt, or that you need to get with the times, or that you need to you need to get out of the Stone Age. We're no longer living in the 16th century. We're no longer living. All of this rhetoric is what's implied within it is a concept or an ideology of progress, and that is the only way in which it can be understood. If somebody is perhaps unconsciously saying this sort of stuff, they need to understand that they have inadvertently or subconsciously taken on elements of kind of Enlightenment and Western thought. I'm not saying it's a bad thing as such, but it's very important to be aware of this. And if it's not an influence you want to be subject to, then the only way you can go about being aware of it and maybe ridding yourself of it is by understanding the genealogy of this kind of thought, where it comes from, and how we as Muslims must interact with it, or how we can interact with it, and the kind of contradictions that come into place when you try to be a practicing Muslim, for instance, while holding on to a concept of progress. How does that? How can you justify loving the Prophet ﷺ and considering him to be the peak of moral and human development, while at the same time considering that we are inadvertently progressing towards the best, or at the very least, this moment in history is better than any that has gone before it. They are two mutually. You cannot hold on to they're two. It's logically impossible to hold on to those two ideas at the same time. So it's very important for us to just be aware of where our beliefs come from, And yeah.
Oh, 100% Khubaib, and that's something hopefully might be a takeaway from this Qatar World Cup. Like so many people are saying, like Muslims say, oh, why all these negative narratives coming out about like Muslims and Arabs and stuff, and it's like no one's surprised, but like saying, if we understand things genealogically or epistemologically, then we can navigate the vagaries of the modern world and understand what is correct. When we ground ourselves in the moral resources of Islam, and then we can be sure that we are moving towards a more authentic worldview and not being influenced by these really harmful narratives from the Enlightenment, from basically liberalism. We're saying the Enlightenment, but the strongest or progeny of the Enlightenment that exists today is liberalism. So that's the big issue for us. But yeah, after we understand things, hopefully in that way, I was going to say something.
While you think on that, though, Zain, I just want to add quickly on that point. Someone, it might be the case that you think, why is it so important that we have a very clear kind of line of transmission, or a very like clear idea of where thought comes from. And I would say actually, this is at the heart of the way in which Islam, all of the sciences of Islam, were transmitted. The idea of having a very clear line of transmission from us as individual Muslims, going all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ. It is the foundation of all our sciences, whether it's hadith, the narration of hadith from one person to another, going back to the Prophet. The narration of fiqh rulings, again, it's very much attached to the hadith. Even things like spiritual practice, there has to be a clear line of transmission from us to the Prophet ﷺ, or from your teacher to the Prophet ﷺ, in order for us to consider this authentic or legitimate. Exploring the genealogy of thought is a very Islamic concept, and it's very important that we go back to that. We have to have a very clear understanding of where our thought come from, and in what way it is linked to our tradition, and if it's not linked to our tradition, where does it come from, and why do you hold on? Can it be understood from an Islamic lens? Is it compatible with Islam? If it's not, then why do you hold on to it? If it is, then then what Islam offers is already there. So it's very important that we have a very clear kind of line of transmission when it comes to our thought, and so on, from ourselves to the Prophet ﷺ. Sorry, go on, Zain. I interrupted you.
No, not at all. Like everything you're saying is a great example of like the tangible the tangible structures we have in Islam to take care of us. We were saying earlier how the modern world is, according to Zygmunt Bauman, who I think is a great author, it's just liquid. That the solid structures of family and morality, they're just being melted, and we're just in this liquid world where everything can change, and we're not going to do that. We don't want to do it. It's not desirable, and it's not healthy. And this is something important to realize, because you mentioned earlier how some Muslim countries and Muslims as individuals are trying to join and ally themselves with Euro-American civilizational endeavors, whatever you want to call it, in terms of ideology or economics or whatever. And ultimately, one of the important things to realize about the Enlightenment is that it is self-defeating, that the products of the Enlightenment, liberalism, Marxism, they destroy the things you need for a healthy society. The social structures, the religion or the morality or the traditions, these are the things that sustain and build a society. And Nietzsche recognizes it in like all of his books. In fairness, something we probably agree on in our understanding of Nietzsche is that he says, no matter how much he disagrees with Christianity, it built up European civilization, took care of it. And then he was saying is that we should get rid of it and create our own morals. But anyway, that it's recognized by the most anti-Christian person that tradition morality takes care of a society and builds it up. And getting rid of these things, which is what liberalism and Marxism and the Enlightenment does, progressing beyond these things is something that's, you're getting rid of what made you successful and healthy. And there's so many examples of this across Western and Euro-American civilization. But a great example is from a guy called Robert Putnam. He wrote this great book called Bowling Alone. the decline of American social capital. And he was saying that social capital, social cohesion, relationships, and trust in society, these are the things that that create success. One of the main facets that creates successful societies. Even Francis Fukuyama, and the history man, he recognizes that. But the reason why his book is called Bowling Alone, he's drawing attention to the importance of social cohesion, social capital. He draws attention to the fact that America is a society that was traditionally very strongly imbued with social capital, trust, and associationism. You had parent-teacher organizations, you had Jimmy Hoffa and labor unions, you had your church groups and choirs, and you had like Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and bowling clubs, And he said that more people now today, more than any other time in American history, are bowling alone. Again, he says, and he uses that as an example as to why trust in society and social cohesion, having friends, is just disintegrating. And he was saying that in the 90s. And just like a year ago, he came back and wrote a new preface for that book. But he said, my book is still relevant. It's even more relevant today. And so that's like he's writing about this in a sort of sociological way. But it's just extremely obvious to me anyway that this is just very much a product of the Enlightenment. He's drawing attention that America is throwing away one of its prime resources, that social capital trust. But that's what the Enlightenment does. It makes you turn away on your own past, your own tradition, your own values. It destroys the things that sustain it. And so this now today when we're looking at Muslim countries doing the same thing, it's like you're joining in what is ultimately going to be a defeat, and it's so funny. That's what you see in Saudi Arabia with them, like trying to alienate the importance of Islam and alienate its impact on society. It's actually a really Eurocentric conception of society's progress that they're enforcing right now, and it's ultimately something that's just like corrosive, and it's just going to blow up in their face.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And actually, when it comes to the breakdown of social cohesion and literally people bowling alone, as you say, what we see there is the manifestation of another actually outgrowth of Enlightenment thought, which is the concept of individualism. As you emphasize the rights of the individual above that of society and so on, and as you break down the vertical relationships that an individual has in favor of the relationship that an individual has with the state, more and more you start seeing this kind of thing, that people no longer operate as they traditionally would have, as communities and families and tribes and so on, and they operate more and more as individuals whose only significant relationship is that with the state. So much so that if we look around us, particularly perhaps in very advanced Western societies, advanced in terms of how far down the Enlightenment project they've gone down. Many people don't have any particular worldview. They don't have any particular kind of moral foundation. Perhaps their only understanding of what it is to be a moral human being, as perhaps would have traditionally been understood, is to follow the law, to be a good citizen. A good citizen is basically somebody who does not break the law of the state, which is just an abnormal state of being, because humans traditionally they have had a plethora of things which have contributed to their understanding of the world. It hasn't just been their relationship with the state. It's you have family, you have tribe, you have community, church, mosque, and so on. But that as an outgrowth of I guess Enlightenment thought, we're having this growth of individualism. It's another thing that perhaps it's very difficult for Europeans to understand about our communities back home, like in Qatar and other places. You can't just force these new weird, strange new ideologies on people, because they aren't just individuals who can like take up ideologies as they like and let them go as they like. They are part of communities and so on, and what they do within their community affects everybody. vice versa. So it's a very different like social makeup, and alhamdulillah hasn't been as broken down as perhaps here in London or in other urban centers in the West.
Yeah, you see, you kind of see kind of a reaction to that now, particularly in America. The likes of even the likes of Jordan Peterson, and I would say to an extent Alex Jones and others, they're pushing this kind of pseudo return to traditionalism, but at the same time, it's not really grounded in anything. It's kind of grounded in this makeshift idea of American / pseudo kind of Western Christian values. But again, it's a modernization of those kind of ideals. But it does seem to stem from kind of what you're saying, this kind of breakdown of things such as the family structure, and kind of just certain morals, things like that, as well as a general distrust of kind of their own government and kind of where their society is heading. But when it's not grounded in something solid, like what we have as Muslims, then it's still very wishy-washy. It's not very clear what the actual kind of values are.
100%. I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Abeer. Like specifically, people like Jordan Peterson and whoever else, they're blatant, just their reaction to the modern world, and they're people who are aware of the inequities of their society, and then they've just come up with some hodgepodge solutions because it's too late, And when I was talking earlier about that's the self-defeating nature of the Enlightenment, that's something specifically that I don't know if I mentioned. That's something that John Gray recognizes about the Enlightenment. John Gray, who's wrote the book Enlightenment's Wake, who I'm a big fan of. But it's that's the problem, like you're saying, Abeer. They're just trying to cobble together some sort of idea based on the past, but they've already destroyed their past and discarded it. How are you going to go back to something you destroyed? And ultimately, they're still trying to have. They want to have some Christian values, but attach them to modern liberalism. It's just not coherent or solid, or systematic. It's not. It doesn't make any sense, So it's just it's a poor response. And to what you were saying as well, Khubaib, you were saying like how the modern person doesn't have an ideology, doesn't have a set of beliefs other than what he gets from the internet or at school, or the hegemonic processes of globalization and state authority. This is basically where you get your ideology these days, either some globalized American culture or whatever your local state tells you. And those are basically, if you're not a person who's out there searching for a worldview, then this is basically what you get. And that's obviously really problematic. And I'm going to quickly refer to, don't laugh, Khubaib, but all three of us have seen this film, Ghost Dog, Way of the Samurai. It's actually, this is going to sound silly, but it's a film about, obviously, I'll just describe it for the viewers. It's a film about African-American gangster working for the mob in America, obviously. And he has decided to live by the values of the Hagakure, the Book of the Samurai. And I really feel like this film is a sort of a microcosm of what we're talking about. It's a modern person totally alienated from his own tradition, from any set of morality. So he just chooses to live like a samurai. He chooses to live by the book, the famous Japanese text, the Hagakure, because he wants to have a meaningful life. And that's the situation we're in today, where where the world is liquid, we're out there in the sea, and people are just trying to hold on to rocks, and realistically, like, we're the last man standing. It's the Muslims. Outside of the Enlightenment and liberalism, there is no other ideology which is realistically going to sustain a civilization or succeed. China is a mixture of Marxism and capitalism. They don't actually have their own authentic tradition they're trying to live by. They're trying to mess around with Christianity, Confucianism. It's a bit of a joke. Russia doesn't have a worldview really, other than being powerful and acquiring geopolitical aims. So what is there besides the solid of Islam? And
exactly.
So that's Yeah, sorry.
As a global alternative, I was going to say, but yeah, continue then. Sorry.
No, that's it. As a global alternative, obviously besides Ghost Dog living.
On that, I will say that it's very important because, of course, we brought up Jordan Peterson and his ilk. It's very important that any Muslims who follow these kinds of figures that they understand that actually there are much more beneficial things that we can derive from our tradition, and even things like the Hakuri, or we've also recently read in full or in part, like Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. I mean, if you just want a nice little work on practical ethics, which actually, when you consider it, don't really depart too much from Islamic practice or principles, just go read a short work like that, and you will benefit far more than you ever will from, I don't know, watching Jordan Peterson, and you will get the same kind of content. Pretty much, and quite interestingly, when you read works like the Hakuri or even Meditations, and then you turn to books of classical, maybe Islamic chivalry and so on, you will find that Islam has covered much of what these ancient, or when it comes to the Hakuri, it's a medieval work, but by individuals who probably had never come into contact with Islam. You will find that Islamic scholars and Islamic, teachers of chivalry and so on, they covered a lot of what these ancient philosophers or medieval warrior philosophers did. So our tradition has everything that we need in terms of how we to live, and how can we face the modern world, and how can we stick to our foundations in the face of this, as you say, Zain, liquid modernity. It's all there. You just need to go out and stop watching Jordan Peterson and start doing something that is a bit more serious than that. Yeah. may Allah have mercy on your soul. SubhanAllah. But yeah,
brother. Yes, no, 100%.
But yeah,
it's interesting how we have these classical works, and even going to like the 19th century and probably even the 20th century, there's valuable literature to gather there from both the Muslim and non-Muslim world. But there seems to be a real starvation of that in this century, particularly, and there hasn't been, as least not that I can think of, any significant work from a philosophical point of view in the latter half of this century. And I think that's a big reason that people flock to the likes of Jordan Peterson, even Andrew Tate, and a lot of these guys is due to that kind of starvation of philosophical literature or perhaps guidance, and probably the ease of social media, and that probably plays a big part as well, I'm sure. There definitely seems to be a large knowledge gap in that area now.
Yeah, no. The fact is that the modern project has left a huge vacuum when it comes to the normal things that the traditional people would have had, and that helped them live and thrive. And it's not sustainable, whether in the material sense, in the way that the Enlightenment project engages with the natural world, or in the way that engages with the human being. Even the idea of the way we work. Our lives have completely been turned towards economic gain. For ourselves to a certain degree, but more so for the capitalist machinery that just runs the economy, the advanced economies of many Western states. So people have, as you say, they've been left wanting, and they're looking for something more. They realize, they understand by their fitrah that there's more out there than this emptiness, which the modern project has facilitated, and that's why they turn to the likes of Jordan Peterson and others. But I think that there are more useful things that they can be doing, inshallah.
100%. Yeah, there's lost in that liquid world, and obviously from our perspective, we can take like a lot of comfort and pride and strength that that the moral resources of Islam are all we need. And like we were saying, that there's lots of these young people looking out, but we don't need to look out when we can look inward into our own tradition, into its strengths and its advice, and use that to create ourselves as healthy individuals. But then also, obviously, that's how we would also want to create healthy societies, and that's obviously where we come to today, like, with the World Cup, with Qatar fundamentally not wanting to create a society based on liberalism. And that's the issue. It isn't a, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? It's like, why aren't you like us? Why don't you homogenize, self-colonize, bow to the imperial and hegemonic processes of our dominant cultural discourse? Why don't you do that? And it's because we don't need to, want to, or it's not desirable or efficient. It's not even good for you, So it's just nonsensical. And this is why I said earlier, and I'm always going to say this: we're the last man standing. The Muslims, the Islam. So it's something I take great pride in, and it's something that once I think we fully appreciate, we can be sure when we go. We were talking about epistemology and knowing where knowledge comes from. Like, we can be certain that what you're latching onto when you latch onto Islam it has lasted and will continue to do so. Whereas as we move into this brave new multipolar world, this where like liberalism is on the decline, where the liberal economics is on the decline, where there are emerging powers, you can be sure that we can be quite confident, quite sure that Islam's going to have a say, and that ultimately, like you were saying, Khubaib, that the domain of modern times, it's technological and economic. It's material. It's material desires and a material ideology that determines things, but it's Islam that offers us a moral paradigm and a moral domain through which to govern both ourselves and societies. That's going to be what's best for people, and it's ultimately it's even like for plenty of non-Muslims, they probably fundamentally would prefer if morality had a greater place to play in their societies rather than the output oriented material modern state.
Yeah, and actually, on the matter of Islam is the last man. We Muslims are the last man standing. It's actually, we say it like that, perhaps half jokingly, but this is something that has been recognized by even certain non-Muslim scholars and academics. Chief amongst them, we haven't read him yet, and perhaps he should be a person on our reading list. A guy called Edward, I think Edward Dussel. Dussel, that's his surname in all cases, and he actually talks about how when it comes to the Western world, they are the imperial force of the present. They have no way of getting beyond their state of imperialism and so on, and so giving an effective alternative which is more healthy for people generally. Russia was it was the other side of the pole of the USA for a while, but now they no longer really have the capacity to be a true world power, and I don't think they desire to really give a global alternative. Russia's current policies are very, very Russian centric. Even if they do have some kind of worldview, it's very Russian centric. The idea of orthodoxy and Russianness and so on. So it's not really an alternative for people worldwide. China, it could have been an alternative. This is Edward Dussel's analysis, but it more or less had just kind of healed over to the capitalist imperial kind of Sunnah trajectory of the West. The only force really standing, and this is his analysis, not mine, and he's a non-Muslim Argentinian. You can look into him. His analysis is really the only force remaining that can give an alternative, really a radical one, in the positive sense, is the Islamic world. One that is not imperial, one that is not, that doesn't have a lot of the negatives that we have seen in the Western imperial project, and that we're perhaps seeing in the Chinese one. So, yeah, it's a very real reality that we Muslims offer an alternative, which none others, no other force in the world does. And that's probably a good good to conclude on.
No, I agree. Last man standing, boys.
That's the world. But no, I think this was a really interesting discussion. I think it's one of those. There's you know, I mean, we've been recording for an hour, but it could go on for longer for sure. It's such a nuanced topic, but yeah, thank you, Zachar, to both of you for coming and leading the way with this topic. It's something both of you are much more knowledgeable on than me, so I could only throw in a few tidbits here and there. But I think hopefully for you know, anyone watching or listening, this was beneficial and insightful. It probably would be worth doing some kind of a book recommendation or a book list as well. We can post that on social media, you know, on all our channels. So hopefully we'll do that, inshallah. And yeah, hopefully next we'll have an episode sooner rather than later as well on the World Cup. Inshallah, that is in the works, and more content probably regarding that, as I was there in person and got to see it there. And yeah, we'll leave it there. So thanks to everyone for watching and listening, and inshallah we'll catch you on the next one. Assalamu alaikum.